is this? Hey, were you on camp when they grabbed you?
Welcome to Screen Recaps, and today we are going to be recapping the movie The Abandon. In Iraq, American forces are engaged in a crucial battle. Miles and some teammates take cover inside a crumbling building while exchanging fire with the enemy. Tragically, their captain is shot in the neck and dies in Miles's arms. Suddenly, an explosion rocks the building, and a bright light appears. Miles runs up a hill to continue the fight, but a bullet hits him in the stomach, and he collapses. As he looks up, he sees two missile-like objects fly by, followed by a strange aircraft that shines a light on him, causing him to scream before passing out. Miles wakes up later in a strange, windowless and doorless room with gray panels. In pain and bleeding heavily, he tries to stand but falls again. Crying out for help yields no response, so he uses his emergency supplies to clean and wrap his wound. He attempts to use his radio, but it doesn't work. He then notices the word "abandon" on the wall, which wasn't there before. Desperately, he calls for help in Arabic, but to no avail. The wall now reads, "Abandon all," and the floor shows, "Save the sinner's soul." As he looks again, the phrase changes to "Abandon all hope." Feeling dizzy, Miles removes his backpack and clothes as the room's temperature rapidly increases. He sweats profusely and starts to panic, hitting the walls and begging to be let out. His sweat boils upon hitting the ground, making him wonder if he's dead. Growing paranoid, he grabs his gun and shoots at the walls. Eventually, the heat becomes unbearable, and he falls to the ground, screaming in pain before passing out. When Miles wakes up again, the temperature is back to normal. He hurriedly grabs his flask to drink water, but the room starts spinning. He is thrown around with his belongings, getting hurt each time he hits the spinning walls. After a few minutes, the spinning stops, and Miles realizes the room has changed positions, with words now in different spots and some of his things stuck on the ceiling. Initially, he freaks out, thinking it's a dream. After calming down, he tries the radio again and hears a woman's voice briefly before the call ends. Miles deduces the room is refracting the signal and remembers his cell phone, which is now on the ceiling. Unable to recall the number, he uses his binoculars to check the sticker and carves the number into the floor with his knife. Suddenly, the phone starts ringing. Miles jumps to reach it, worsening his wound. He throws a shoe, but it also gets stuck on the ceiling. Frost begins forming on the walls, so Miles quickly puts on any clothes he can reach and curls into a fetal position as the frost covers his face. Moments later, the frost disappears as quickly as it appeared, leaving Miles with purple fingers. Miles rubs his body to warm up and hears the phone ring again, but he only responds with a gesture of frustration. Suddenly, an alarm blares, and the room begins moving again, causing the phone to fall. As Miles is tossed around painfully, he manages to grab the phone just before the spinning stops. He also finds his helmet and retrieves a picture of his wife and daughter, tucking it into his pocket. After chewing some gum he had before the battle, he checks the call log on the phone and dials the number that called him. Initially, there's only static, but then he hears a woman's voice. She explains that she's been kidnapped and is in a spinning room, prompting Miles to ask for details to confirm if their situations are identical. When the woman mentions a lack of light sources but still being able to see, Miles realizes their bodies might be the light sources themselves. He tries to ask more about her situation, but she becomes suspicious, thinking he's part of a scam. Miles loses his patience and yells, revealing he's also trapped and bleeding. The woman, now frantic, apologizes and agrees to cooperate. Her name is Damsey, and she was on the highway before her abduction. Miles recalls his team was near a highway and is startled when Damsey guesses he's a soldier based on his questions and demeanor. Damsey suddenly groans in pain, and Miles feels his tags being pulled back, choking him as an invisible force spreads his arms and makes him drop the phone. His body begins to float, and a bright light appears, pulling and stretching his limbs before dropping him to the ground. Damsey can be heard falling as well. Miles hears a strange noise and warns Damsey that the room is about to move again. This time, the walls start moving inward rather than spinning. Panicking, Miles tries to push against the wall but falls and loses consciousness. When Miles wakes up, he finds the room has shrunk, triggering a panic attack. Damsey calls again and tells him her room is shrinking too. She reassures him with calming words as she deals with her own pain. Miles notices unfamiliar words on the wall, which Damsey confirms are present in her room as well. She mentions that no one grabbed her while she was on the highway, referencing a location in Massachusetts. This confuses Miles, as he thinks they're still in Iraq, and he realizes it doesn't make sense for them to communicate over such distances. Damsey is also unsettled, noting that setting up a situation like this would take days, and she's only been there for about an hour. She questions why anyone would abduct her, but she did see the same phenomena in the sky as Miles did before being taken. Miles tries yelling through the walls to see if Damsey can hear him, but she doesn't. He wonders how she got his number, and Damsey explains it appeared on her ceiling. At that moment, another call comes in, and Miles tells Damsey to call him back later before answering. A man starts speaking in another language, and Miles requests to speak in English. The man on the phone speaks broken English, but he manages to convey that they can't win because they can't solve the equation, and therefore they must die. Before Miles can ask for more details, the call ends and the phone switches back to Damsey. While changing the bandages on his wound, Miles asks her if she knows anything about an equation, but Damsey says she can't see any equation. Damsey then suggests they try to establish a pattern to understand why they were chosen, as she can't believe it was random. She shares that she's an algebra teacher and engaged to a former soldier, but she doesn't sound very happy about her fiancé, implying he changed a lot after returning from war. In return, Miles admits he and his wife aren't currently on the best of terms. Miles eats the last rations from his backpack while watching the words on the walls. Some of the words have years, ranging from 1951 to 2007. Miles thinks they're fake and meant to mess with them. As for him, it's 1991. Damsey laughs, realizing he isn't using a smartphone, and mentions things like social media and selfies, but Miles doesn't understand her. Suddenly, the room starts glowing and emitting a noise that makes Miles's ears bleed. He checks his watch and notes that the room's movements are happening more frequently. He writes the times on his arm before grabbing his head, screaming in unbearable pain and passing out. Moments later, he wakes up, trembling and having trouble breathing, unable to pick up the ringing phone. The word answer appears on the wall, so he forces himself to take the call. He tells Damsey there's not enough air and realizes the room is even smaller now. Damsey shares her theory that she, Miles, and other people are all in the same room at the same time, just in different years. She asks him to draw something on the wall, and Miles makes an X, which is then surrounded by a hand drawn by Damsey. In her time, the year is 2020. She talks about the fourth dimension and mentions she's always been better than average at math, prompting Miles to confess he's always been good at math too, but was never the academic type. Feeling exhausted, Miles falls to the ground, pointing out that these beings are probably testing their bodies with all the changes to the room. He asks Damsey about the future and is saddened to hear the war is still going. Miles calls it the sins of the father and shares that his own dad fought in Vietnam before passing out. Damsey calls his name, and he immediately wakes up, saying she needs him. At that moment, Miles notices his Arabic dictionary has fallen out of his bag, and some of the symbols match those on the walls. He starts translating the message and writes it on the floor so Damsey can see it too, and the final result is an equation. Damsey recognizes it as the work of a famous mathematician who studied higher dimensions but never finished it. Another trapped person must be a mathematician and wrote it as a clue, making Miles and Damsey realize the kidnapped people are all connected to math in some way. Suddenly, someone starts scribbling over both the Arabic equation and the translation to cover them, so Miles hurries to write what he remembers on his arm. Then Damsey confesses that she works as a teacher but actually has a very advanced degree in math. Her fiancé got her the teaching job because he doesn't like it when she talks smart. Damsey asks Miles if the war has changed him and made him hurt someone he loves. Miles explains that war transforms people into animals. Guessing that Damsey's fiancé might be abusive, he shares that his own dad used to beat his mom. Miles was too young to stop him, and the one time he tried, his dad threw him on the pull-out bed and shut it, trapping him inside while he heard his mom being beaten. Damsey concentrates and remembers the equation, so Miles asks her to write it on the wall before another change happens. She struggles because she's using her keys to scratch the wall, which takes time. At that moment, the room starts shaking, and Miles's hands are forced to the ground by a stronger gravitational pull. His knees are pulled down too, and the bullet is pulled out of his wound before his face hits the ground, causing more bleeding. Miles screams in pain, but it ends in a few minutes. A troubled Miles reaches for the phone and curses when he sees the cracked screen. Then the alarm rings, and the room starts spinning again. Since it's smaller, Miles can jump from wall to wall instead of being thrown around. The spinning doesn't last long this time, and the light goes out for a few seconds. When he can see again, he notices the room has shrunk even more. Trembling, he reminds himself to keep it together and tries the phone. At first, nothing happens, but eventually, Damsey answers. She's interrupted by a call from the foreign man who says they can't see or know. He keeps repeating that they must fail the sacrifice. Miles hangs up and talks to Damsey again after the static stops. Damsey says she broke her arm, is running out of battery, and believes death is their only option. Miles realizes she's been working with the foreign man the entire time. Damsey shares what she knows. They were captured by a superior species testing human intelligence to see if they're a threat. Damsey thinks humanity isn't smart enough to go against these aliens, but Miles believes they can learn to control the room with enough concentration. As Damsey thinks about the equation and how the solution must be the answer to escaping, the light goes out. In the darkness, Miles starts having flashbacks of the war and his dad beating his mom, causing him to yell under the psychological torture. He squirms on the floor, reaching for his gun, but he can't defend himself from something in his head. Eventually, the flashbacks stop and Miles tells the aliens they've won, asking them to end things. He cries and prepares to end his life if necessary. He says he can't deal with his trauma anymore and asks his dad why he killed his mom, admitting he's slowly becoming his father but doesn't want to be. Reminding himself that he isn't his father, Miles lowers the gun and calls Damsey, who is also crying. She saw flashbacks of her fiancé and admits she has scars from the times he beat her. One day she finally ran away, driving so fast down the highway that she crashed, and that's when the aliens took her. Damsey asks Miles if he ever hurt his wife. Miles answers that he never did but has thought about it. Disgusted, Damsey hangs up. Then a call comes from the foreign man, scolding Miles for trying to solve the equation. He insists they mustn't win because humans could become as dangerous as the aliens themselves. The creatures shouldn't see Earth as a threat, or who knows how they might react. It's better to pretend to be innocent lab rats. Suddenly the alarm rings and the room starts shrinking again. Miles tries to stop it, but to no avail, and soon his body is twisted in a very tight space. Damsey calls again and asks the same question, so Miles swears he never hit his family. He had urges, but fought them to avoid being like his dad. Miles thinks he's sick and insists Damsey should solve the equation because she's the better person and deserves to get out. He apologizes for who he is and for what Damsey went through, and Damsey forgives him. Miles asks her to find his family and tell them he loves them and that they deserve better. With renewed determination, Damsey focuses on finishing the equation, using the intervals between the room's movements as clues. The answer is 1, so she concentrates on taking control of the room to spin it once, but nothing happens. She realizes that one person alone cannot be a threat. The answer signifies mankind as a unified whole. The aliens want to see if humans can put aside their differences and work together. Miles joins in, concentrating and pushing the room to help Damsey. Together, they scream in unison until the room suddenly explodes into a bright light. To their astonishment, Damsey and Miles find themselves touching hands and floating in the light. The wall panels float around them, revealing all the other kidnapped individuals. This indicates they have solved the equation and freed all the victims. Damsey and Miles greet each other with a smile before disappearing into the light. Seconds later, Miles reappears back in Iraq. He starts making his way back to his team, only to hear sirens wailing and see planes flying overhead. When he finds the American troops, they are looking at something ominous in the sky.
I thought I was